Good evening, I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, November 3rd. We begin tonight in the nation's capital, where the federal government delivered its fall economic statement today in the House of Commons. The fall economic statement projects a $36.4 billion deficit for the current fiscal year. Now, that will shrink over the next 4 years before turning into a budget surplus of $4.5 billion during the 2027 to 2028 fiscal year. This is the first time since the Liberals came into power 7 years ago that a federal budgetary surplus is in sight. But the surplus projection is clouded by a potential recession, promises for a green energy transition, and the need to fight another election. All right, moving to Ontario's ongoing education worker labor dispute. Ontario Premier Doug Ford says education workers left him no choice but to use legislation to quash a strike. The government is trying to pass a bill that would impose a contract on the workers represented by CUPE and ban them from striking with steep fines if they don't comply. Now, regardless of the legislation, the Canadian Union of Public Employees has said its members will start a strike tomorrow until further notice. The Ontario Public Service Employees Union says its 8,000 education workers will walk out at the same time in a show of solidarity. All right, well, back in Ottawa, 3 more organizers of the Freedom Convoy protests are to appear today at the public inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. Benjamin Dichter says he came to Ottawa to protest for an end to mandates and to spread a message of, quote, peace, love, freedom, and unity. Now, Mr. Dichter says he traveled to Ottawa in January after being invited by organizer Tamara Leach to be a spokesperson for the protesters. The testimony adds to the long list of evidence that the Public Order Emergency Commission is examining. This is to understand how the government decided to invoke the Emergencies Act in mid-February. All right, well, meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly joins her peers from the G7 in Germany today. The 2 days of talks in Münster include the war in Ukraine, tensions in China, and Iran's treatment of anti-government protesters. Foreign ministers will take stock of the situation in Ukraine. This comes nearly a year after they first banded together. This was to warn Russia of massive consequences if it went ahead with plans to invade its sovereign neighbor. Russia's war has also exacerbated global shortages of food and energy. All right, well, back at home, a new report is outlining health spending across the country. The Canadian Institute for Health Information predicts that the country's total health spending this year will be $331 billion. Now, that works out to over $8,500 per Canadian. The projected spending in the Institute's annual report released today shows a 0.8% growth, which is the lowest since 2015. And it follows 2 years of unprecedented increases in health expenditures due to COVID-19. The report notes the health expenditure reflects the country's overall economic situation. So when the economy shrinks, so does the health budget. Moving to Western Canada now, where new research by the government of Alberta has found wind-blown dust from coal mines has polluted a pristine alpine lake. The paper was published last week in the journal Environmental Science and Technology. It concludes that it is crucial to consider more than just downstream effects from such mines. The paper comes as the province's United Conservative government ponders whether to retain a ministerial order protecting Alberta's Rocky Mountains from proposed open-pit coal mines. Newly released data shows employers are concerned about their employees and profits. A survey commissioned by the Ontario Pension Plan suggests employers are very worried about employee burnout and the effects it could bring to their profits. As a result, some employers and industries are introducing better retirement benefits. This while addressing employee mental health issues through new programming. The survey finds more than 4/5 of employers are worried about the competitive labor market. This while almost 2/3 are worried about employee productivity. Well, as Remembrance Day draws nearer, a project by the Canadian War Museum is taking a unique approach to capturing the oral testimony of military veterans and their family members. The In Their Own Voices project is asking about their post war experiences, both positive and negative. Museum historian Michael Petro says the goal is to illustrate the social change that can result from military service and conflict. The project has so far interviewed 120 veterans and family members and plans for 200 more interviews and an online video exhibition planned for 2025. We'll be right back. Stay with us. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised its key interest rate 3/4 of a point to a range of 3.75 to 4% yesterday. Now, that's the highest rate in 15 years. It was the U.S. Central Bank's sixth rate hike so far this year. But the Fed is suggesting that it could soon reduce the size of the rate hikes, depending on the impact they have on economic growth and inflation. Well, joining us now to give us his take on these recent hikes is Thomas Caldwell, chair of Caldwell Securities Limited. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
So, what are your thoughts on yesterday's rate hikes?
Acceptable. I think I would have preferred to see him easing up on the increases. I know it sounds like a double negative. I would rather have seen a half of 1% than 3/4 of 1%. But he did indicate that they will probably ease off a tiny bit. I find it quite ironic that the people who caused the inflation are now going to be the ones to solve the inflation. Remember, it's been central banks that printed the money, drove interest rates down to nothing, enabled governments to spend significantly, causing inflation. And now they're doing exactly the opposite, as if somehow they've ridden into town and now are the saviors of this terrible thing that somehow it happened. So it's a little bit ironic.
Now, that's really interesting, sir. Outside of the United States, how are these high interest rates impacting other countries?
Well, it's an indirect influence and it's devastating. What these high interest rates are doing is pushing up US interest rates, obviously, but there's a lot of what they call hot money that roams around the world looking for the best short-term rates. And that money is flowing into the United States and pushing up the US dollar. Now, remember, less developed countries around the world have tremendous amounts of debt in US dollars. So frankly, for the emerging world, this is devastating. And interestingly enough, a few countries have reminded the US of the damage they're doing around the world. And it really is, it's very, very hard on them. So I don't know what the ramifications of that will be, but it is causing pain to less developed countries.
And what about governments, sir? Do you think governments are doing their part to tackle inflation along with central banks by any chance?
I think they're doing the opposite. I graduated in economics and philosophy, which makes me functionally useless in the real world, of course. But from an economic point of view, the governments are spending more money, and they're saying, well, it's anti-inflationary. I mean, President Biden says we're going to spend this money to help people deal with inflation, but that's part of the problem. Government's flooding the system with free cash for whatever purposes and whatever reason, and somehow calling that anti-inflationary. It's not. It's pro-inflationary. So you got the governments, the administration, with their foot on the gas, and the central banks with their foot on the brake, which is counterintuitive. How this all works out will be quite interesting, but they're both marching to quite different drummers at the present time, and it's interesting to watch how their verbiage doing the wrong thing, but if you put the right verbiage, it sounds better, and that's really where we're at. Canada seems to be trying to control deficits to some degree. Christopher Freeland's coming up with some measures, it seems, later on today. Some of it quite bizarre, frankly, but we'll see what they come up with. But basically, they're not in sync with central banks, as I can see it.
All right, sir. Well, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm sure a lot of our viewers are thinking. Do you foresee an end or easing in sight from central banks?
Well, again, it sounds kind of perverse. It'll be an easing of the tightening, if that makes sense to anybody. I think Mr. Powell already indicated that the next increases may not be at this level. I think they might try to fine tune it a little bit. So you might see a few more increases, but I think they'll be smaller in magnitude. Remember, central banks have put the economies into the ash can on many occasions in the past, because tightening money now doesn't have an impact for maybe 12 to 18 months. And they're hitting a target that's way out there, and you don't know what the world is going to look like then. So you could be hitting with the impact of these measures at the worst possible time. So I think they're going to try to be a little bit more careful from here. Now, remember, interest rates have come up from ridiculously low levels of literally zero interest rates to close to the 4%, say, for Fed funds. That's not killer at this point in time, but they might have a few more little bit increases, fine tuning it. But I think they're going to be careful at this point in time because they can do real damage 6, 12, 18 months from now.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Mr. Caldwell, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Nima. All the best.
Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at greedflation and the Canadian grocery sector. A new report from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University finds that the top 3 grocery store chains have made higher than average profits. And this comes amid rising prices and, of course, interest rates. We'll take a look at that after the break. New research says Canada's top 3 grocers have all posted higher gross profits this year compared with the last 5 years. And a lack of transparency in their financial results prevents the public from understanding where the extra profits are coming from. The report by Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Lab says Loblaw, Metro, and Sobeys all recorded higher than average profits. But the report authors say that without more detailed data, it's difficult to explain why all 3 supermarket companies are exceeding their average performances this year. Samantha Taylor is a senior instructor of accounting at Dalhousie, and she says the publicly traded companies lump sales from grocery stores, drugstores, and other merchandise together. Now, this makes it impossible to tell whether grocers have increased food margins or whether consumers are spending more money on higher margin products, such as cosmetics and apparel. Well, Professor Taylor joins us now to tell us more about this. Ms. Taylor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hello, thank you for having me, Nima.
Now, an interesting term was mentioned in your report, greedflation. So let's start with that. What is greedflation?
For sure. So greedflation is a term that's been used to discuss the amounts of profits charged by grocers or really anybody in excess of what would be typical by so-called taking advantage of higher inflationary times.
And this report looks into the grocery industry in particular. So you're pointing that all 3 grocers are lumping sales from other product lines together, and this is making it virtually impossible to tell if grocers are increasing food margins. So, Ms. Taylor, is this a dead end when it comes to this research?
It really could be, absolutely. So one thing that we did look at was how did each grocer compare to their gross profit, that is, revenues less cost of revenues, relative to their last 5 years of performance. So we really wanted to dig into how they're doing in 2022 relative to their past. And what we found was interesting. So relative to each grocer's past average performance, each one of them is having a better year. However, only one of the grocers is having a better year versus their best performance of the past 5 years. So we are not left with, conclusive evidence or, really answers, but what we are left with are more questions. Why in a state when Canadians are paying more for housing, paying more for utilities, and paying more at the grocery stores, why are in fact one of the grocers having on track to have one of their best record years ever?
More questions indeed. Now, what other detailed data is needed in this investigation, and is it realistically available for researchers?
I mean, ideally, we would like to have the cost books and really get to see what the sales for individual items are and what the cost of those sales are. Is that realistic for researchers? No. Is that data that the companies have? Absolutely. So, we really are, like you said, at a dead end.
All right, well, if we look at this report's conclusion, it mentions that unless companies open their books, you cannot prove or disprove greedflation among Canadian grocers. So would it be in the public interest to force grocers to open their books?
It definitely could be. However, there might be, a little bit of a halfway point. If perhaps grocers opened up more transparency as far as each segment, so perhaps food, retail, merchandising, and really helped us see each operating segment, not lumped in together, but really individually, that would provide us more answers. Also, if they allowed, say, one of the big 4 audit firms to come in and do a test to specified procedures. So I really hesitate to recommend opening up the books completely because on the other side, we understand that grocers and companies in general need profits in order to innovate and to bring food safety as a forefront to our country. So I don't want to necessarily dissuade their competitive advantage, but I think consumers want more answers and we need data in order to give them more and better answers.
All right, Ms. Taylor, looks like we've got about a minute left here, but we know the Competition Bureau is currently investigating the grocery sector in terms of competition in that sector. What are you hoping will come out of that investigation?
Ooh, I'm hoping for some answers, but honestly, it's not likely. Grocers are not compelled to give those cost of revenues, which would really help conclusively understand really is there excessive profit margins on food, and if so, where? So I'm not hopeful, but I'm optimistic that possibly grocers will, come to the table with more data for the Competition Bureau, for consumers in general, for researchers. I really hope that they, back up their words and with some numbers.
All right, Ms. Taylor, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world as North Korea fires more missiles amid rising tensions and Russia damages power lines in the Zaporizhzhia plant. Stay with us. North Korea fired at least 6 missiles into the sea, including an intercontinental ballistic missile that triggered evacuation warnings and halted trains in Japan. The test came an hour after North Korea threatened to retaliate. This was over a decision by South Korean and U.S. militaries to extend large-scale joint aerial exercises, which are in response to the North's ramped-up testing activity. The South Korean and Japanese militaries say North Korea later fired 3 more short-range missiles into waters off its eastern coast. All right, well, meanwhile, Ukraine's nuclear state operator says Russia has shelled and damaged power lines which connect Europe's largest nuclear power plant to the Ukrainian grid. The attack has left the Zaporizhzhia plant reliant on diesel generators again, this with only 15 days worth of fuel left. The International Atomic Energy Agency says the repeated use of backup power from generators further underlines the precarious nuclear safety and security situation at the facility. Turning to Pakistan now, where officials say a gunman opened fire at a container truck carrying former Prime Minister Imran Khan. A party official and police say Mr. Khan was wounded in the leg and was not seriously hurt. Mr. Khan was traveling in a large convoy of trucks and cars heading towards the capital, Islamabad. This as part of his campaign aimed at forcing the government to hold early elections. All right, well, speaking of elections, the U.S. midterms are set for November 8th. Ahead of the vote, President Joe Biden is imploring voters to save American democracy from Trump supporters. He pointed to election-denying lies and the violence that he says they have inspired. Mr. Biden shined a spotlight on Trump's ultra-mega Republicans. Last night's speech came days after a Canadian man seeking to kidnap U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi severely injured her husband in their San Francisco home. The Bank of England has announced its biggest interest rate increase in 3 decades. The bank boosted its key rate by 3/4 of a percentage point on Thursday to 3%. Now, this was after consumer price inflation returned to a 40-year high in September. The bank has predicted a 2-year economic contraction through June 2024. The Office for National Statistics says that would be the longest recession since at least 1955. Moving to Spain now, where thousands of workers have rallied in Madrid in a protest called by Spain's labor unions. This was to demand higher wages to offset the higher cost of living fueled by global inflation. People marched through Spain's capital on Thursday under the slogan "Salary or Conflict." The unions want Spain's government and business leaders to increase the minimum salary above the current €1,000 a month. Inflation in Spain peaked this summer at 10.8% in July and moderately slowed to 7.3% in October. A new report says nearly 8 million people in South Sudan, or about 2/3 of the population, will face acute food insecurity during the next lean season. It comes as climate shocks and conflict deepen the already vulnerable situation for many. The report released by United Nations agencies says the proportion of people at such risk in South Sudan is at the highest ever in the country. Pope Francis is urging Bahrain authorities to renounce the death penalty and ensure basic human rights for all citizens as he arrived in the Sunni-led kingdom. The pontiff landed on Thursday in his first papal visit to Bahrain. He immediately met with the king at the royal palace, and there he didn't shy from some of the most contentious social issues raised by human rights workers and Bahrain dissidents. They have accused the Sunni-led government of systematic discrimination against the Shiite majority. All right, well, meanwhile, the International Committee of the Red Cross says it is seeking support to create what it calls a digital Red Cross Red Crescent emblem. The proposed emblem would make clear to military and other hackers that they have entered the computer systems of medical facilities or Red Cross offices. The organization said it hopes the emblem would identify the computer systems of protected facilities as much as a Red Cross or crescent on a hospital roof does in the real world. All right, well, this year's World Cup in Qatar will be the first since Diego Maradona's death. Argentina's soccer superstar died in 2020. Mr. Maradona's most memorable feats and failures are being replicated in street art, and a massive mural was inaugurated this week on the side of a 14-story building in Buenos Aires. Meanwhile, Canada is in the World Cup for the first time since 1986, and it will open Group F against Belgium on November 23rd. All right, take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.